Welcome to GDPR by Noor. In this lesson, we will discuss what is Article 7 of GDPR. This article is critical because it sets out the specific legal conditions that make consent valid. Without meeting these requirements, consent cannot serve as lawful basis for processing personal data. Article 7 sits in Chapter 2 of GDPR, which covers the core principle of data protection. Think of it as the enforcement mechanism for consent. While Article 411 defines the consent, Article 7 tells us exactly what controller must do to obtain and maintain valid consent. This article has 4 paragraphs, each paragraph addressing different requirements. It's also supported by recitals that provide additional context and interpretations. Let's break down the structure. Paragraph 1 requires controller to prove that they obtained consent. You can't just claim you have it. Paragraph 2 deals with how consent request must be presented clearly, separately, and in plain language. Paragraph 3 establishes the right to withdraw consent and requires that withdrawal be as simple as giving it. Paragraph 4 addresses freely given consent, specifically preventing organization from tying consent to contract performance when the processing is not actually necessary. Each paragraph addresses a specific problem that existed before GDPR. Paragraph 1. This paragraph shifts the burden of proof to the controller. You must be able to demonstrate that valid consent was obtained. This means keeping detailed records. When consent was given, what information was provided, what the person consented to, and how they indicate their consent. This implementation, the accountability principle, come from Article 5.2. If you can't prove it, you don't have it. Simple documentation like timestamps, consent log, copies of consent forms, and records of what information was provided are essential. Paragraph 2. Clear presentation. This paragraph addresses a common pre-GDPR problem, consent hidden in terms and conditions. If you are asking for consent as part of a longer document, that consent request must stand out. Use clear heading, separate checkboxes, and plain language that anyone can understand. The consent request can't be buried on page 47 of your terms and conditions. And here's a key point. If any part of your consent request violates GDPR, that part is not legally binding. You cannot hide behind, but they agreed to the terms and conditions. Paragraph 3. Right to withdrawal. Data subject can withdraw consent at any time. This is a fundamental right. Two important points here. First, you must inform people of this right before they give consent. It's a part of making consent informed. Second, withdrawal. That must be as easy as giving consent. If someone can sign up with one click, they must be able to withdraw with one click. Withdrawal doesn't make previous processing unlawful. Everything done before withdrawal remains valid. But once consent is withdrawn, you must stop processing unless you have another lawful basis. Paragraph 4. Freely given consent. This paragraph tackles consent bundling. You cannot make contract performance conditional on consent for processing that is not necessary for the contract. Here's an example. If you run an online store, payment processing relies on contractual necessity under Article 6.1b, not consent. The processing is required to fulfill the contract. However, you cannot require consent for marketing purposes, which would choose Article 6.1a as a lawful basis as a condition of making a purchase. The key distinction is this: when processing is necessary to perform the contract, you use contractual necessity, not consent. When processing is not necessary for the service, you can ask for consent, but that consent cannot be mandatory. This ensures consent is generally freely given, not forced. Three key recitals explain Article 7. Recital 32 explicitly rules out pre-ticked boxes, silence, and inactivity as valid consent. Consent requires a clear affirmative action. Recital 42 reinforces that controller must demonstrate consent and that data subject needs to know who's processing their data and why. Recital 43 addresses power imbalances and granularity. You cannot force people to consent to everything as a package when the processing activities are actually separate. These recitals are interpretive tools that courts and regulators use. EDPB Guidance. The European Data Protection Board issued comprehensive guidelines on consent in May 2020. These guidelines clarify how Article 7 applies in practice. Key takeaways are cookie walls that block access unless you consent are not considered freely given. Simply scrolling down or swiping up doesn't constitute a valid consent. Public authorities generally cannot rely on consent because of the inherent power imbalance with citizens. This guidance is essential reading for compliance team. What does compliant consent look like? A separate checkbox specifically for newsletter sign up, not bundled with account creation. Clear language like I consent to receiving marketing emails rather than legal jargon. An easy unsubscribe link in every email. The ability to use the core services even if you refuse marketing consent, and proper documentation showing exactly what consent was given and when. These practices demonstrate respect for user choice and meet Article 7 requirements. Common violations to avoid: pre-tick boxes violate the requirement for affirmative action. Consent buried in terms and conditions violate the clear presentation requirement. Making service accessible conditional on marketing consent violate freely given consent. Requiring user to call customer service or navigate multiple pages to withdraw violate the easy to withdraw requirement. And failing to maintain records mean you cannot meet the demonstrate requirement. Each of these is a compliance risk. Without valid consent under Article 7, any processing based on consent is unlawful. This exposes organizations to enforcement actions, fines, and reputational damage. More fundamentally, Article 7 protects individuals' autonomy. It ensures people have genuine control over their personal data. It prevents the pre-GDPR practice of organizations claiming they have consent when they really don't have. This article makes consent meaningful rather than legal fiction. Let's summarize the essential points. Article 7 converts abstract consent requirement into concrete enforceable obligation. All four paragraphs work together. You cannot skip any of them. You must be able to prove valid consent was obtained. Withdrawal must be genuinely accessible. And you cannot use service access as leverage to obtain consent for unnecessary processing. These are not suggestions. They are legal requirements with significant penalties for violations. Thank you for watching. For more GDPR insights, follow GDPR by Noor.